and welcome to the Secular Nation Podcast, brought to you by the Atheist Alliance of America. I'm your host, Tim Brannan. Michael X is cannot be here because he is at the American Humanists Association convention. With me is HeinaDadabhoy, who I met at the Women in Secularism convention 2 weeks ago, who introduced me to the wonderful game of Slash, which is an awesome alternative for all you people who are just sick of Cards Against Humanity. Heina?
Hello.
Glad to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure.
All right, and you are, you're a writer for Skepchick.
Yes, I am currently at Skepchick. I write with all the other Skepchicks. I'm going to be, as soon as they get the new layout, getting my own blog at Free Thought Blogs whenever that happens. So,
awesome.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now in terms of writing on the internet.
And you're also, you're working, or is it finished yet, or are you still working on your book, Skeptic's Guide to Islam?
I'm working on that. That should be, I promised my backers that the manuscript will be done by fall.
Oh, nice.
Especially because nothing's set in stone yet, but I've been in talks with lots of people for lots of other fun things. So, I want to keep doing things.
If I'm not mistaken, you were born in America, correct?
Yes, I was born and raised in Irvine, California. And
that's an interesting thing because our last episode we had Faisal Saeed Al-Muhtar on, and earlier we had Miriam Namazi on, who are both, coming from Muslim nations. So I was always interested in seeing the difference of experience between, someone coming from, a Muslim background, in a majority Muslim country, versus someone coming from a Muslim background here in America, where Muslims are the minority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very different experience. I mean, there's the obvious where I didn't have to fear that the state would come after me. There's no anti-apostasy laws in the United States. We have anti-treason laws, but I hardly think defecting from Islam, especially in post 9/11 America, would count as treason. If anything, it might be the opposite. Although they still do stop me more at airports. Mm. That's a whole other story. But there are subtle differences. I would say a big part of it is immigrant Muslims, not always, but often enough to where it's notable, tend to be a little bit more religious than their compatriots in the quote-unquote Islamic countries. Part of that is this sort of defensiveness you get as an immigrant, and you see this across immigrant communities where people immigrate to the United States. They perceive to be the social ills of the American style of living, and they sort of batten down the hatchets and say, we're going to be stricter than our own parents in raising our children. And that is precisely what happened with my family when I was about 5 years old, where suddenly they were way more religious than they'd ever been. And this is a fairly common thing with, I think, a lot of ex-Muslims who are, at least primarily from the United States or Canada. The UK is its own hot mess. But yeah, I'd say in North America, that tends to be the experience where we come from slightly more practicing families. So though we don't have to worry about the state, sometimes we do have to deal more with families who feel betrayed or, I know at least with some members of my family, they lament the fact that they immigrated to the United States for economic reasons because then they, quote unquote, lost their children in the process.
Where was it that they immigrated from?
My family comes by way of a lot of countries. I mean, ethnically speaking, we can be traced back to a single village in Gujarat, India.
Oh, okay.
But Indians get everywhere. So my family comes by way of a lot of countries. My grandmother was born in Mauritius, which is a tiny island off the coast of Africa. If you zoom into Madagascar on the map, there's a tiny dot next to it. That's where my grandma's from. I think one of my grandmothers and one of my grandfathers was born in India, and I think one of them was born in Burma.
Wow, that's quite a broad collage of from.
Yeah. Yeah, and my dad grew up a refugee. I mean, and didn't really grow roots until he came to the United States as a teenager. My mother was raised mostly in Pakistan, but she moved to Canada as a teenager and then came here for a vacation and never went home. Well, she ended up getting married and all that.
Oh,
It's
nice.
my father. Yeah. Yeah, they were actually the only non-arranged marriage in my family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, at least in their generation. Some of the other differences I noticed, too, are that with, foreign ex-Muslims versus ones here is that those of us who are born and raised in North America and leave Islam, we do have a lot more resources at our disposal. If you're a woman living in a lot of those Islamic countries or Muslim majority countries, whatever you want to call them, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Who are you going to talk to? Can you even establish things on your own? So where, someone like me, if I realized, oh, I'm an atheist, oh shit, that's bad, my parents are going to be angry, I could get a job and work and save the money, or apply for student loans, which is what I did. I figured out a way to make it work, and it's not so easy for a lot of those foreign ex-Muslims.
No doubt. So what led you to your deconversion?
I feel like my entire life did. But to highlight some of the more interesting incidents. Yeah. When I mentioned earlier that when I was 5 years old, my family got more religious. Before then, they prayed, they fasted, they didn't really eat pork or anything like that. But, my mom didn't cover herself. My parents would go to Vegas, not to drink, but to gamble. They were sort of lax in their practice of Islam, which is really common. But when I was about 5, my mother met this religious teacher, and I don't know what happened. I guess it was a combination of meeting that person. Also fear, I think, because I was 5, my sister was 3, and she was worried that this corrupt American culture would lead to us being pregnant crack whores at age 13, or they literally would take the worst. They would hear the worst things. They would watch all those investigative news programs and see the worst of American society and fear that we would fall to that. And the idea was that if they got religious, then they could use that sort of to inoculate us against these horrid evils as they perceived them. Because I would say it's really hard for parents to make cultural arguments, especially the parents of immigrants, or the children when you're a child of immigrants. My parents couldn't exactly say, oh, you have to behave this way because back home that's what we did. First of all, my parents came by way of several countries, so what argument could they make? And secondly, I could always say, well, I'm an American. Why should I follow Pakistani or Indian rules? But with religion, they could sort of say, well, God says so. Too bad. It's a great trump card. So for any number of factors, my mom got really religious. She started covering. We moved to London for a year, actually. Yeah. My mom has family out there. There are areas that we affectionately or not so affectionately refer to as Londonistan. We stayed there, and I got quite a brainwashing for a small child, especially a small, literal, bookish, socially awkward child. So I took to being religious quite well. My bookish nature sort of lent itself very well to it. My mother bought all these religious texts for adults, and I would finish reading them before she did. I was just devouring this information. And to me, it made sense that if I was going to follow this religion, I was going to follow all of it. And I assumed that other people who were Muslims who didn't follow as much of it as possible didn't do it willfully. I thought they just must not know. And so I came back to the United States the most annoying kind of religious person and was loathed for it. I went to Islamic schools until 8th grade, and everybody hated me. They thought I was trying to be self-righteous or holier than that, when in reality I just didn't want them to go to hell. And I thought they didn't know. I thought they'd be eating something that they quote unquote weren't supposed to, and I'd be like, hey, did you know XYZ rule? And they'd look at me with this disdain. It was pretty awful, actually. But even within my own family, my cousins would make fun of me for being as religious as I was, but I took comfort in this sort of, I would read stories about martyrs and say, well, at least I'm not being martyred. And at least, hopefully Allah will give me a reward someday. So I would say my faith was pretty unshakable until my sister had a horrendous carnival ride accident.
Oh.
When she was 10, she was barely 10 years old. I think she turned 10 in the hospital. Mm-hmm. She got injured pretty severely in a carnival ride accident on mosque property.
Oh.
And she was rushed to the trauma center at the local hospital because they didn't know what to do with her. Mm-hmm. And I still remember, this was the first time I doubted my faith. The doctor came out of the room, and we were all waiting to hear what had happened. And he called me and my baby brother, who was a baby at the time, an actual baby, and my mother and my father, and he said, there are no injuries to her brain because they had just run the CAT scan. And my father and mother started weeping and praising Allah for saving my sister. And I remember standing there, my baby brother's tiny hand in my hand, and thinking, why didn't Allah just not let the accident happen in the first place? Like, why are we thanking him that her brain isn't touched? Oh, great. Every other part of her is torn to bits. She broke her femur.
Oh.
You know how hard it is to break her femur? You have to literally hit it with a hammer to break it. And so we were praising God for saving her brain, but basically mangling every other part of her. And I remember having that thought and immediately saying, you can't think that. That's bad. Everything happens for a reason. There's some greater lesson that we will learn someday from all this. But that was a big crack in my faith. It at least started me down the path of doubting. The moment after that, I would say what also put some cracks in the foundation of my faith was 9/11. But not for the obvious reason, though. It wasn't that, oh, God, these Muslims are carrying out horrible attacks. Because I knew in my head that they weren't real Muslims. Mm-hmm. What really made me doubt was having all my peers, because 9/11 was my second day of high school. So that colored my entire high school experience. All my peers were approaching me and saying things like, does your religion actually teach violence? Does your religion actually teach that you have to kill every non-believer? Why aren't you killing me, essentially? And so I had to go in and research. And when it comes to these Abrahamic religions, the more you know, the less you're going to like it. Especially if you're a woman. That always got in the way, being a girl.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to make me leave Islam. I was complicit in my own oppression in some ways, but it was always enough to sort of make me sad about being a Muslim. Because, I'd go to a Friday sermon and it would be awesome, and I'd say, oh, someday I'm going to give a great Friday sermon, and then thinking, oh, right, I can't. And it's because apparently women's voices are just too sexually exciting. Mm. And if I were to go up and give a talk, then everybody would just fall into lustful frenzies. Just for the kids at home listening, that didn't happen at Women in Secularism. I can promise you that. Everybody conducted themselves in a befitting manner.
I can attest.
Yes. But yeah, so the gender stuff started to bother me, and I found out more about it. And there were just certain things that bothered me, and I was trying to figure out ways of justifying them, ways of making sense of them. And I would manage, but it was very tenuous. At that point, my faith was strong enough to weather a lot, but it was weathering more and more every day. And it wasn't until my first year of college, though, that anything ever happened with it. My last year of high school, I did spend sort of having existential crises constantly because I learned about existentialism.
Oh, yeah. That'll do it.
So there was that, and then I was in a drama class, and the drama teacher used to kind of mess with me. He would sort of make fun of me for adhering to the gender segregation that I was under as a Muslim, because I wore a full headscarf, I wore long, loose clothing and everything. And in drama class, we would be asked to do activities that involve physical contact with other students, and I constantly had to try to avoid boys because I didn't even shake hands with men because that was touching them. So I didn't. So he would purposely do things to try and mess with me. I managed to get around him. I also took a class that was entirely comprised of discussion and debate. Mm-hmm. And this teacher is a self-described agnostic Jew, and he would, like I said, my second day of high school was 9/11. So in this class on current events, guess what came up a lot? Not only that, but I was in the class. There was this hippie kid who believed in crystals, and there was an ardent Zionist Jew who was going to move to Israel after he graduated and joined the army there.
Fun.
Yeah. So the only thing we were missing was a devoted Christian. If there were any, they all didn't say anything. But there was constant, banter and debate and stuff in that class. And my teacher would occasionally drop little truth bombs that would come back to haunt me. Like once he looked at me and he indicated my headscarf and he said, "The only thing that bothers me about this is that you've made your decision so young." Mm-hmm. And 16-year-old me was indignant. Yeah. I'm mature enough to make my own decisions, but
yeah,
it did make me think. So I get to college, I take my first philosophy course. It just happens to be on the foundations of Christian theology. And on top of that, I take a week-long intensive Islamic seminar run by self-described Muslim intellectuals. And through both these things, I learn about essentially theocratic deconstructionalism, the idea that even as a Muslim, not theocratic, theological, that would be the word. And the idea there is that even as a theist, even as a believer in a religion, you can still deconstruct your beliefs because if they're true, you're going to end up in the same place anyway. So I took a deconstructive approach, but I didn't end up where I thought I was going to end up. And I've always been into writing, into recording my thoughts. I used to journal religiously, if you can forgive pun, for years. I started when I was 9. I have journals dating from the time I was 9 up until I was 18, because that's when I was doubting. There's a 6-month black hole where I literally wrote nothing of my own thoughts or feelings because I was so involved in, I didn't realize it was a deconversion process. It was just a period of intense doubt. And I just didn't know what to do with it. I could barely think it to myself, let alone write it down or talk about it. But ultimately I made a friend in that class who sort of saw what was going on. And because it was germane to the class to talk about belief and theology and all that, one day he looked at me and he said, "You're a scarf-wearing atheist." And I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Well, you need to at least admit that you're not a Muslim anymore because you're not saying very Muslim things." And we went back and forth, but he ended up kind of bullying me into admitting it. But that was what I needed. But for a while I was a scarf-wearing atheist. I didn't know what to do with my life or myself as an atheist. I mean, I didn't know how to do my hair. What was I going to do to get my headscarf off? So I spent a little while floundering that way, trying to figure myself out. And eventually just started sneaking out and doing decidedly non-Muslim things. But then after a couple months of that, I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I ended up coming out to my parents. But anyway, so yeah, that's my long, convoluted deconversion story. That's the short version.
Well, thank you very much for that. But so you're working on this book, Skeptic's Guide to Islam. Now, what was it that sort of inspired you to embark upon that project?
Well, I kept going to atheist meetups and getting the same questions, facing the same misconceptions. And, that's pretty common. Mm-hmm. Most people don't know much about Islam, if anything. But what really bothered me is that a lot of these people wanted to criticize Islam and didn't have the basic knowledge at all. And I'm not saying that you have to be some sort of theological expert to criticize a religion. I'm not going to argue that. But I will argue that if you're going to criticize a religion for something, at least criticize the parts that are actually there. Or that, I guess it depends on what your goal of criticizing the religion is. If it's just so that you can sort of have a go at the religion, by all means, do as you please. But if you want to actually have a discussion and maybe even have some believers challenge their own beliefs and maybe even sort of plant those seeds that my teachers planted in me that ended up blossoming into this gorgeous sort of godlessness that I love so much now, you want to at least have something slightly informed to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I've quite frequently sort of found myself forced into a position of defending Islam just because the person I'm arguing with or I'm discussing with is sort of so fundamentally ignorant about it, or sort of following so many of these preconceptions. It's because, again, people always talk about, it's like, I don't know, the 79 virgins, or, Muhammad was a pedophile, which, fine, but I mean, I'd like to look into the finer points of it. So
Exactly, and I mean, again, it depends on what your goals are in criticizing. But I feel like most people want to sort of have a productive way of going about it. And the problem is that most of the materials out there are either by Muslims for Muslims, by Muslims for non-Muslims, which means that they're pandering and trying to convert you.
Yeah.
Or by Daniel Pipes and so on. And they're just really mad about the brown people. And so, I wanted to write something that sort of, I come from a Muslim background. I'm not exactly interested in vilifying my family and my former community. But at the same time, there are some good things to pick apart and criticize in Islam. And like you said, the whole Muhammad is a pedophile thing, I don't think anyone ever doubted their faith because someone came up to them and said Muhammad was a pedophile. And on top of that, it's just such an inaccurate term to use because pedophilia means essentially having a significant portion of your sexual attraction towards children.
Yeah.
Whereas, Muhammad had a child bride, but he had lots of adult brides too. And I mean, not that makes it any better. I'm not saying it was good. But yeah. I'm saying to call him a pedophile is one thing. To call him perhaps a child molester or, someone who married children, which is bad and we don't like that, sure, go for it. And I think there is a valid criticism. Well, I guess since we're talking about it, or I decided to go with it, there is a valid criticism to make because we now even most Muslims view child marriage as an abhorrent thing, but their perfect prophet did it. And plenty of Muslim men use that as an excuse to exploit and abuse young girls. And, there's a good argument to be made there. But I don't know about just saying Muhammad's a pedophile.
But yeah, I think as you were saying, there is that sort of division of trying to make, legitimate criticism of Islam versus, just being a racist. To me, I think I made the comparison in my last show about how it's kind of like, criticizing President Obama, like from an actual, examination of his policies, or just because, you think he's a Kenyan Muslim communist, whatever.
Don't forget atheist.
Yeah, that too.
He's a Kenyan Muslim communist atheist
who also
who wants to enslave all white people.
He's an atheist Muslim. He's an atheist Muslim, and he follows the Reverend Wright, who says "Goddamn America." So he's all parts of the Venn diagram or something.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, there are legitimate criticisms, and I want to not only equip fellow skeptics, atheists, and godless types of all stripes to better criticize Islam, but also just to have a better understanding of where other ex-Muslims are coming from. Because, I mean, I'm mostly writing from the perspective as a Western born and raised ex-Muslim. My relationship with my apostasy is very different. My relationship with my identity is very different. I still face anti-Muslim bigotry, even though I'm a flaming atheist. I still get stopped at the airport more. I didn't even know that you could get to the airport without being checked. Mm-hmm. And it happened to me once when I was wearing an atheist T-shirt of all things. And I Facebooked it and I said, I think they forgot to check me. and all my white friends are jumping in to say that happens to me every time. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. I had no idea that was an option. I thought you had to do all those things to fly. So, my relationship with all these things is made different because of my background. And giving people some understanding of it, I think, will also help them to be more compassionate and more empathetic towards ex-Muslims, which there are more and more of us out every day. So we're going to, the reason we're out there, too, is just to let other ex-Muslims know that we exist and they're not alone.
All right, so you are a member of a number of organizations of ex-Muslims in the United States. I mean, what is like the experience of? How does your experience compare to like other ex-Muslims?
I would say mine is not uncommon. I mean, there are different sort of narratives. Like there's mine where I was super religious and I left, which is pretty common. Some people weren't that religious, but I'd say many of us used to be very religious. And, it's hard, I would say, for those of us who, there are some people in ex-Muslims of North America who never were religious, so they can get away with a little bit more. Their parents don't really notice the difference. But for those of us who are very religious, it's kind of obvious. And I've had people in my family ask me, why did you come out? I said, if I suddenly stopped wearing my scarf, you would have noticed. And of all people in the family, me, I was the perfect religious golden child who was going to, convert the whole world to Islam while strapping babies onto my back or something. I was going to be the perfect Muslim wife and also save the world from sin or whatever. So, of all the people in the family to leave Islam, for me to even like reduce my practice of Islam would have been highly visible. And, that's why actually the one criticism I get from Muslims that does get under my skin are the ones who say I never was actually a Muslim. That really bothers me because, go back even 10, 15 years and go tell teenage me who was on her knees weeping, facing Mecca every night, begging God for forgiveness for every little sin she committed, which most Muslims don't even know the sins that I was begging forgiveness for. They didn't know that those things are sins. Go and tell her she's not a real Muslim. Yeah,
it's one of those things I kind of think is that a lot of times, like, a lot of converts are sort of those who were more devout because, they actually had that kind of momentum. Rather than, if people are just kind of like wishy-washy about it, they really don't have much motivation to really examine their faith and whether it's true.
Exactly. And not to say there aren't members of ex-Muslims of North America who weren't that religious in the first place and, they saw through it. But, that's why, when the New York Times thing, I'm glad it came up. I'm pretty frank about the fact that the deconversion was painful. I talk about how great my life is now, and it is, and how I don't have to worry about sin, and that's wonderful. But, leaving Islam was, essentially tearing my skin off so I could grow a new one.
And, how well do you think that those within the ex-Muslim community fit in with the atheist free thought movement as a whole?
It varies. Mm-hmm. I know that's not really an answer, but there's some issues where it's tough because, you got all these atheists who want to talk about Islam and they don't know much about it. And sometimes it's just better to not try to argue, but you want to every time. Yeah. You get people making, sort of unnecessary, if not racist remarks. There was a guy who used to come to an atheist meetup I used to go to, and he used to talk about how he used to say sexual comments to Muslim women he would say throw them off, because the point of covering yourself was not to look sexy, but if he told them that they looked sexy, then maybe they would reconsider their religion. And I had that happen to me once when I was Muslim, and I thought I was scared.
Yeah, that's
I didn't
cool.
understand. Yeah, it's mean-spirited, and it doesn't really help anybody. So, you get those kinds of people. And there's also the problem of, if you defected from a very sort of mainstream religion, like mainstream Protestantism or even Catholicism, it's not quite the same as leaving a much more involved religion. And the average Muslim is way more involved with their religion than the average Protestant. But, that's sort of mitigated by the fact that there are other people who left very restrictive religions who aren't ex-Muslims but are still sort of they have parallel experiences. The first person I met who I could relate to was an ex-Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
And since then I've encountered ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, what do you call them? The Orthodox Jews. That's it.
Hasids?
Yeah, the ex-Hasidic, ex-Quiverful too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. These are people that I can relate to because, detangling yourself from that much religion it's a process. It never really ends. But, it's entirely worth it, not to sound bleak.
That is something I hear a lot from the deconverts from Christianity. There's a period of, them still getting over the idea that, I might still be going to hell or whatever that. I mean, were there any of those feelings during your deconversion?
Yeah, no, I mean, I it wasn't too hard for me, but I just didn't know how to act if I wasn't a Muslim. It was just such an intrinsic part of my identity. Like I joked earlier about not knowing how to do my hair, but before my clothing was entirely restricted. I couldn't just go to the store and buy something. I'd have to find something that was, modest enough. So the idea of going shopping and just finding clothes that I liked and wearing them because I liked wearing them was just bizarre. I didn't know where to start. I wore nothing but band shirts and jeans for probably 2 years.
Awesome.
Which, I looked fine. I fit in at college. Mm-hmm. I didn't look out of place or anything. Or things like actually dating was really hard to navigate because I'm, first of all, awkward and nerdy in the first place. And then I've never even shaken hands with a boy in 10 years. And I wanted to date, but I didn't know how. And
you're starting off at the grade school level. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of interacting with people of the male gender. So, the internet did save me, as it has saved me many times. I Googled everything and I joined dating sites. That's how I got around it and found other awkward people, and figured it out that way. But there were just so many things that, and I mean, on a broader scale, leaving Islam opened my horizons. Where before I'd have to find a job that would accommodate a marriage, and I knew that I would just get married and have children, and that was my set life path. Suddenly, I could do anything. I could, figure out what I wanted to do instead of what worked with my religion. I mean, Muslim women in considering career choices, have to consider things like contact with the opposite sex.
Yeah.
And you don't want to have a job that causes too much of that, and so on. So, yeah, there was a lot to figure out, and I still am figuring it out. But it's nice to be able to try things out and sort of not have this looming set of restrictions that is going to make your life much harder.
True that.
It's sort of interesting going from being part of America's second most hated minority to America's most hated minority.
Welcome.
Yes. That's actually one of the things that sort of makes me, it's why I often have sort of a wry grin on my face, because I see other people and, they're afraid of telling their bosses that they're an atheist, or, they're an atheist, but they don't want to tell anybody that they're polyamorous or that they're gay or any of those things.
Yeah.
And I sort of look at that with this, okay, I spent 18 years of my life telling the whole world that I was part of a minority that's pretty darn hated just by my clothing. I downgrade to atheism, which is more hated than Islam. And I told my family, my community, and the entire world that I'd left a religion that you're not supposed to leave. So in some ways, I have this great advantage of being fairly fearless, because what could happen that's worse? So I do try to understand that not everyone has that background, but that I think informs the way I approach the atheist movement a lot, where okay, so someone's going to be mad at me or kick me out of something. I've been there before. I can bring myself back up again. And I would say that's probably something that I share with other people who've left very devout and close religious communities. not only are you freed from that, but you're kind of free to do almost anything else because, well, you've already been through something that fundamentally scary.
Would you say that, I don't know, people's reaction, the general population's reaction to you as a former Muslim might be more or less positive the experience of perhaps a former Christian?
Christians think that I'm a convert waiting to happen. So there's positivity there, but the kind I try
Not
to
the
dress
good kind,
down.
yeah.
I try to dress them down as soon as possible, just so they know that, that's why I use the word atheist instead of agnostic, so that they know I'm not really looking for any. I know the word agnostic doesn't mean that, but they assume agnostic means like softcore and willing to listen to.
I've had that conversation so many times.
Yeah. So I won't get into it, but I will say that I say atheist very deliberately. In terms of other secularists, I almost get an embarrassingly positive reaction because they're used to hearing of the Ayaan Hirsi Alis and the Taslima Nasreens. So they hear from me and they think, oh, she must have, had to escape some horrible country, or her parents must want to put her to death, or, any number of things that, while they are true experiences of other ex-Muslims, they simply don't apply to me.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of "you're so braves," and I say, I guess. Maybe not as brave as you think I am, or maybe not for the reasons that you think I am.
Yeah.
But, I mean, not to say life was been a cakewalk for me as an ex-Muslim, but it's definitely not, I'm not under armed guard 24/7.
That is one thing about, the Islamic countries is a lot of times I kind of hear them sort of, like, a lot of times I'll hear Christians say, it's like, why don't you atheists talk about Islam or talk about the Islamic countries? And it's usually in a sense of, talk about this, don't talk about, don't talk about us, don't talk about Christianity, don't talk about the things that are currently happening in this country as opposed to things happening somewhere far off. And I see that a lot also with issues of feminism too. It's
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I get these. Sometimes people don't know I'm an ex-Muslim when I'm talking about feminism, and so they say things like, "Well, don't you know that women in other countries have it worse?" I'm like, "Why, yes, I narrowly escaped that by an accident of birth."
Yeah.
That are you saying that? It almost feels like a threat when people say that. It could be worse, so you better shut up and stop trying to make things better. And, it's not, you're not a good person. You're not more equitable in your dealings, and you don't try to make a world a more equal place. You don't do it because to prove that you're better than other countries or other cultures or other people. You do it because it's the right thing, allegedly.
Yeah.
And, a lot of these things are close to my heart because I'm a former Muslim.
Yeah.
I don't look at my background and say, well, the sexism there was worse, so the sexism here is fantastic. I look at it and say, wow, the patriarchy is everywhere. Even though it manifests itself in, of course, a far less obvious and violent way than in other places, the fact of the matter is, sexists, whether they're atheist or religious, and whether they're Christian or Muslim, they're ultimately making the same arguments. And they're ultimately sort of, I like to joke that we can't let the religious people know that they have so much in common. Because if they do, then we'll be outnumbered.
Yeah.
But, I hear stories from people who are, from a Jewish background, and it's eerily similar. Rebecca Goldstein and I were on the same panel at Women in Secularism, and we just spent every minute we had where we were hanging out during that conference, we were comparing notes and exclaiming at the similarities. And, and the problem is that most of the world is religious, and so you get this religious-based sexism seeping in through secular channels. Because none of us exist in a vacuum. We're all socialized within a culture, and then that culture gets sort of infected with things from religion, like sexism. And, For me, it was an obvious choice to move away from sexism and into a more equitable viewpoint. But, if the sexism wasn't as obvious to you in your former religion, or if you never had a religion, you just may have never had a reason to look at it and examine it and dismantle it. And also, it's kind of dehumanizing to use the experiences of women in other countries and other cultures as sort of a prop for your argument.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're not even a person who have had these bad experiences anymore. They're just sort of a rhetorical pawn for you to tell other people to shut up about things you don't care about.
Exactly.
It's the starving children in Africa argument, just in a different form.
That's kind of my thoughts on the whole issue of quote unquote first world problems. It's usually they're first world problems because, actually, trying to solve them or think about them and talk to them would require a person to reevaluate, their own lives, their own opinions, their own behaviors, as opposed to something going off in some other country far away that's sort of beyond our grasp.
Even some things that people think are first world problems, there are people in other countries who are working on these same issues. It's not like people working for equality in other countries, aren't quote unquote advanced enough to care about the things that we care about. There are Muslim sex ed activists in the Middle East. And, we just think, the people working for gender equality in the Middle East, they must be, working against whatever we think is important. But, there are revolutionary people in those countries who are doing things that we still are behind on. And so, it's sort of a simplistic and linear view to say, of course, I'm not saying that we're behind them in most things. I don't think we are. It's pretty obvious. But, they're, like I said, there are Muslim sex activists in the Middle East, just like there are in the United States. And they're just as needed in both places.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation we've had, Heina. And you will have an article in our magazine, Secular Nation, upcoming, correct?
Yeah, and it's about my experience with joining my very first ex-Muslim chat room and sort of how things have really changed with ex-Muslim groups, but people will see why.
For the better, I hope?
Oh, yes. We've evolved, as it were.
We've been talking to HeinaDadabhoy from Skepchick and author of the soon-to-be-released Skeptic's Guide to Islam. Heina, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This is the Secular Nation Podcast, signing out.